Hi, this is Shelley Kraft. We're coming to you live on SNN Live. We're at the Aegis Capital Healthcare and Technology Conference 2014 right here in Las Vegas. I have with me Mr. Oded Har-Even of ZAG-S&W Attorneys at Law. Oded, welcome to
Thank you
SNN
very much,
Live.
Shelley. Pleasure being here.
Good to have you. Okay, Attorneys at Law.
Yeah.
It's a firm that's fairly sizable in the United States and Israel.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about it.
Okay, so basically it's a joint venture firm that was built in 2001, created in 2001 by two firms, Sullivan Worcester, out of Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C., and ZAG, which stands for Zisman, Aroni, and Geyer. That's an Israeli firm, prominent in the field of high-tech. Started in 2001, I joined it from 2004. Since then, we have been working with a lot of Israeli companies, taking them public in the U.S., doing everything for them in the U.S. Can be litigation, labor and employment law, tax, etc. Representing U.S. companies going to Israel. Now we also have an office in London. Through ZAG, we also have a joint venture in China. So we are all over the world. Over 200 lawyers, probably 250 lawyers. Pretty successful.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me just give you a piece of information that you can verify. In the United States, the largest country outside of U.S. companies and the country of the United States, the number one country to supply companies to be listed in the United States happens to be Israel.
Yeah, I believe you're right. At some point, I think Canada was ahead of us. But I think, and at some point also China was trying to compete, but then they had all this bubble burst of the Chinese companies a few years ago. So I think Israel is probably number one, or at least, if not number one, number two.
I'm going to go on record as saying it's number one. You want to argue with me?
Fine. No,
Only a lawyer would.
I'm with you.
Okay, so let's talk about the process of what it seems so difficult when you have a country speaks English and Hebrew and maybe a lot of other languages that now has to be interpreted both in financials and in documentation, and you have to satisfy rules of the home country plus the country you're being listed in and vice versa. This seems like a lot of work and an enormous problematic. How do you work out those solutions?
It is. I always say we act both as lawyers and also as cultural interpreters. So a lot of work, a lot of preparations. You have to change the mindset. For companies that are traded on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, it's actually easier. In a way, sometimes there are certain requirements that are excessive in Tel Aviv Stock Exchange compared to NASDAQ or the SEC rules here. So for them, actually coming here is almost like a better life. For those that are not Israeli companies, meaning they have Israeli companies but are incorporated in the U.S. for whatever reason, and they are subject to all the executive compensation rules. And this is a tough one for many of them because suddenly they have to make so much disclosure about everything. Say, I have to disclose my salary, I have to do this, I have to do that. It's not easy, but the more companies we have from Israel, the more people that worked in those companies and they move on to the next company. So you have more and more officers in companies that are already educated and they know the system here. And that's, I think, a very big difference than what was the case like 10 years ago, for example.
So let me ask you, and please talk to the audience. When an Israeli company gets listed in the U.S., they're complying with all U.S. requirements, correct?
Almost. If it's a foreign private issuer, basically a company incorporated in Israel, then they are not subject to certain rules such as the proxy rules. They're not subject to the short swing profits rules. They're not subject to certain disclosures such as executive compensation. Instead of an 8K filing, they have what's called a 6K filing, but the interpretation of when to file is more liberal, I would say, to a certain extent, because many times you go back to the home country practice. So there are some, in a way, for a company like this, I'm not talking about the market valuation, but it's from reporting requirements, it's better to be a foreign private issuer than a domestic issuer.
So here's another, I want to go on because the thing that encourages companies to come to the United States is probably the distribution and the amount of shareholders that they could attain here. And when they're duly listed, is it the same shares or is it two different sets of shares? How does that work? I've always been curious about that.
There are two ways here. One way is basically to list in the U.S. in parallel to the listing in Israel. And then you list certain shares. You know, in the U.S. you list only a number of shares in the market when you file the registration statement. The other one is to file what's called an ADR listing. And basically that's a derivative of the stock, the shares in Israel. And here you can also aggregate. So for example, you have many companies that one ADR share in the US represents, for example, 2 shares or 4 shares in Israel. So the price is different a little bit just in terms of the price per unit or stock. But at the end of the day, it's the same sort of, the market is efficient, so it's sort of the same price.
On my trips to Israel, I have met companies whose technology has absolutely blown me away.
Yeah.
Just incredible technology.
The land of tech and money.
But I'm talking about, you know, people say to me, you know, what goes on in Israel? I said, you know, remember something. They figured out a way to grow fruit in the desert. Right. And they also figured out a way to get water when there was no water, and they didn't need any oil. So explain to me, when all of this technology is coming to fruition, do they do a lot of joint ventures with U.S. companies? Are they kind of selling technology into the United States, or is it that they're doing sales all over the world and putting it into a U.S.-listed company? I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think about.
Yeah, no, first of all, you know, Israel is in the Mediterranean, so it's in a good location to travel to Asia, to Europe, to the US. Israelis like to travel. They go all over the world. They find partners. They market, of course, the products in Europe, in the US, now more and more in Asia, in China in particular. And it's been quite successful. And of course, many Israelis live in the U.S., then they go back or they have the connections here, and as a result, they form more alliances, a strategic relationship. There's a large Jewish community here. Again, people go back and forth to Israel. They start relationship, they find other partners, you know, many investment bankers that help Israeli companies do many things. And again, the more companies that are being sold or go IPO here, the more interest there is in Israel. And as a result, more people that have not been familiar with Israel travel to Israel and want to see companies and want to meet companies and make more connections, and that's how it goes.
Well, you're a good person to ask this final question to. What do you see in the future, both for Israeli companies and also for your firm?
I think, listen, we are growing with our clients. We started, like, when I joined the firm in 2004, we had, I think, 2 public companies from Israel, or one, then we added another one. Today we have close to 15. We're working on 4 different IPOs. So again, the Israelis, they learn fast. They see that so many companies come to Wall Street because the window is open. In fact, only today there was a company that went public, a robotic company from Israel that went public and quite successful. The stock is up, I saw 78% when I just watched it. So I think hopefully for us, there'll be more companies, but I think there will be regardless of whether we are there or not. We're just here to help, and I think we've been doing a pretty good job on that.
Okay, and your website is?
www.ZAG-S&W.com.
That's ZAG-S&W.com. Oded Har-Even, ZAG-S&W Attorneys at Law. I'm Shelley Kraft. This is SNN Live, and we're coming to you live from the Aegis Capital Healthcare and Technology Conference 2014 right here in Las Vegas. Oded, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Shelley. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.